Okay, in this video, let us discuss the Flux architecture for front-end. So in the backend, we have model view controller, and the front-end has typically been lacking in having a architecture for the front end. So Facebook, basically, since they're building large-scale applications and they want a nice architecture for the front end, have defined this new way of doing things for the front end, an architecture called Flux. So it's meant to go with React that Facebook is building, and this is the general structure. So basically you have the web API, and then you have so that's like your server, sending information about different things. Could be payment API, could be chat API, could be some other API, could be newsfeed API for Facebook. And then the web API utilities basically talk to this API. And then we have this thing called action creators, which are basically factories for actions, which we will discuss a little bit later in this tutorial. And then these action creators basically create actions. And these actions are nothing but really just a fancy name for a JSON object, JavaScript object in JSON format, which basically has two parts: a name of an action and the data that action takes. So for example, if you were adding new items to a list, the name of the action could be new item, and the data to add would be, let's say, if you're adding a list of shopping items, then it could be bread or whatever the data might be, napkins. And then what the dispatcher will do is basically dispatch these actions, and these actions will have callbacks into the store. So the store is basically a container for the actual domain knowledge of a specific type of action, right? So like in the backend, it would basically be the models. And so store is basically a container for models. So there'll be one store for all, let's say, the payment-related models, called the payment store. Or there could be one store for all the newsfeed-related models, called the newsfeed store. So it's basically a container for the models of a given domain. And what happens when an action gets to the store is basically it updates or does the given action and updates the data accordingly. And when things in the store change, then the store launches change events. And these change events basically go to the React views and let the view know that, hey, something changed. And you completely re-render the view behind the scenes in terms of the virtual DOM. And what React then does is it looks at the DOM that has been rendered by the browser, compares it to this virtual DOM that behind the scenes, and sees if there's any actual difference. And only if there's some actual differences, then React will update the actual view accordingly. So it's not like you're not loading the entire page over and over, but as far as the code you're writing, you should be. Just go ahead and update the entire DOM, because you're not really updating the actual DOM, you're updating the virtual DOM. So now once you have these React views, basically a user can interact with the view, click a button or scroll or whatever the different user interactions in your view might be. And based on these user interactions, you can create the action creators. Like, say he's adding items to the list, he's adding to a shopping list, so you would basically then go ahead and create a new item in the shopping list, and the action basically will become a JSON object with the new item you're adding, and so that's the data, and the name of the action, which is to add a new item. So this is the general idea behind this Flux architecture. So you have the web API, you have the web API utils, you have the action creators, the actions. The view basically effectively is dispatching these actions through the action creator to the store, and the store is where all the actual logic and the models are stored about how you're going to do that action. And the dispatcher you will never actually stick into the view. You always, it's a different kind of event. That's the change events from the store. So now that we have this, let us look at a little bit of code in order to understand this a little bit better. So we'll just look at the code from this blog post here. So basically, if you're, if it's all static views, you won't really use Flux. If it's dynamic, yes, you can go ahead and use Flux. And so here our views are dispatching actions effectively. So the way you set up the dispatcher, which is essentially a singleton, there's only one of it, is for the entire app, is you just say var app dispatcher is new dispatcher. And then in your view, the way you would dispatch an action, basically button on click, this create new item, and then you're creating a new item with that button click. And the way this new item is getting created here is basically you're creating a dispatch event with the app dispatcher, and this dispatch is basically contains this action name new item, and the name is macro. Like I described, so this is not using the creator yet. So if we want to look at the code when we actually use a creator, it's going to look more like list actions here. There's an add function passing the item, and instead of hard coding the item name, this list actions, this add function here is the action creator, and you'll pass in the item name, and then it will create the item. It'll create the action with the event name new item and the new item. So basically, we're not going to keep rewriting the action JSON individually for each action, right? That would be painful. So that's why we have an action creator. So like in this case, the name is Samantha. And so let's go back to looking at, let's say, okay. So we looked at how to dispatch an action using the dispatcher. Now, the store basically will respond to these dispatched actions by, let's say, so we're creating a store for our list here, and initialize an items array to add these list items. And then, so we dispatched events with the dispatcher, and now we will, in the store, register the kind of the catch or the for these actions that have been dispatched. So the function that will handle these actions that have been dispatched here is in the register function payload. You switch based on the action name in the payload. So payload is basically the action. And so if the case is new item, we will go ahead and push the new item to the items in the list store and break. So a store is not the model, it contains the models. And the store is the only thing in the application that knows how to update the data, right? So the action itself is just a reference to the in the store for how you're going to do it. And the store represents a single domain, like we talked about it. And views should not call app dispatcher register, like we said. They will get the change events. So the change events here. So you can use any event library to basically handle these change events. In this tutorial, they're using this library called microevent.js. And this microevent basically will take this list store And in the store, when we have the case for new item, after we push the new item onto the items list, we will trigger this change. So note that we're not, the change event has nothing to do with the latest item or anything. It's just an event. Hey, the list changed. And then how does the view respond to this change event? It basically just goes ahead and binds a change event to this.list changed. And this list changed is basically a function. Here they're doing a forced update to when the list changes to create the new render. That's a bad way to do it. You don't actually want to use force update. So the correct way for your component to read the store data is to copy the data into the state for the view and then read from this.state in the render function. And you can see this at work in this other to-do MVC example. Let me load this here and see. So, okay, well, let's not go through this right now. But when the component loads, the stored data is copied into the state, and then when you update, you recopy it. And this is better because internally the force update is synchronous and the set state is more efficient, right? So you basically don't want to block by using force update and kind of update more efficiently. So without going too much about updating this component, so the other thing is basically to clean up when you unmount the component. So when we mount the component, we bind the change event to the list store. When we unmount it, so we basically are no longer on the view for list store, we will unbind this change event. So we're not tracking more events than we need to. Okay, so we're unbinding the list change. Okay, so now let's look at this render function here. So remember that list store is, a container is global and we don't have to pass it around. We just get it. We get all the items from the list store and we loop through them using items.map with this callback function list item here, which essentially generates our loops through and generates our list items. So the key for our list is the ID and the name is what we're adding to the list and assigning it to item HTML. And then we're returning in this render the unordered list of all the items and the button that we can click to create the new item. Okay. And so we've come the full circle. We've created our dispatcher, which is dispatching actions. We have registered it in the store to basically, take care of those actions and store them in the list. And we have handled our change events and rendered the view. Again, we don't have to worry about the fact that we're updating the entire view because the React.js will use a virtual DOM and do the diff to actually update the real DOM. Okay, so the key concept is that when the store data changes, then the views shouldn't care if things were added, deleted, or modified, and they should re-render entirely. So we talked about what action creators are. They're basically like a factory for the actions. And we can just call list actions.add in our view and not have to worry about the dispatched object syntax because the dispatching is happening within the action creator itself. So we're creating the action and also doing the dispatch in the list actions.add. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. And Flux is basically just telling us, this architecture and how to manage this data flow in a unidirectional way in this loop. And it does not answer things about, how do you load and save the data to the server, how you should handle your AJAX calls, how do you handle component-to-component communication, or which event library to use, or why Facebook hasn't released all of this as a library, or should you model the layer in Backbone or anything like that. So you can basically flexibly decide how you're going to store your models in your store, and all these, so you can figure out the details based on whichever library you like and so on. But this is the basic idea behind Flux. Okay, so I'm Aditya Mittal, your host today, and hopefully you enjoyed learning this tutorial. Thank you.